Emergence and development of your own views um, as far as racial segregation, civil rights, some of the issues. It's sort of your earliest awareness leading to the mature perspective that you have on these issues now. Where did all that come from, would you say, as our distinguished president?
Well, Clarence, I'm afraid it now spans 6 decades. Hard to believe. I grew up in a relatively small town, but it was a university town in West Virginia. I attended segregated schools until I was in junior high school, when roughly a year before the Supreme Court decision, that state desegregated its schools. So I observed segregation, a little less ugly than it was perhaps farther south, but my views have been enormously colored by the fact that when our schools were overnight desegregated, the group of kids that came together in 9th grade and then on through high school were wonderful. And it was kind of a golden age. We got along with each other, and while we came from very different backgrounds, we became good friends. We played athletics together, we studied together, and it was sort of a golden period. Now, I happen to know, if you go back to that same town 10 years later, like so much of the rest of the United States, race relations hadn't improved, they had degenerated, and they went through many of the same bitter struggles that other parts of the nation did. I lived through the civil rights era. While he was alive, my father and I, for some reason, both remembered watching the Walter Cronkite Evening News one time during the voting rights discussions in the South, and listening to a man, African American, with a PhD, possibly even in political science, who had been denied the right to vote because they claimed that he couldn't pass the literacy test. And there are these little things that stick in your mind and a lot of personal experiences. But beyond that, if one generalizes the concept of diversity, it so happens that my first inspiring science teacher was black. My physics teacher and my math teacher in high school were women. My best friend in graduate school was from India. My thesis advisor was from Turkey. My other, perhaps closest faculty mentor, Choshen Yi, was born in mainland China. So I've had this kind of rich experience of diversity and people who helped me and who I got to know as individuals. And those are the things, I think, more than anything else, that have built my own attitude and instincts toward race and diversity more generally.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, what suggestions do you have, particularly when you look back over your very distinguished career so far, and with all the experiences, what do you think would improve the climate with regards to our culture and racial diversity on campus? When you look at it, all the experiences and where we are now, how would you say our experience is now, and how do you project how we can continue to improve our race relations on our campus, or on any university campus, frankly?
Well, above all, good race relations, in my view, are built the same way good relations among any group of human beings is, by openness and candor and mutual acceptance and mutual learning from each other. So whatever the key to this is, it has to somehow exist in dialogue and in living and learning and working together as fellow students, as colleagues, on as even a plane, as open and honest and candid a plane as possible. How you achieve that, of course, is very difficult to say, but it's indisputable that at some fundamental level you have to begin with numbers. Numbers at the end of the day are not the most important part, but it seems to me that as we look throughout our undergraduate student body, we're fortunate now to have a relatively strong representation of various minority groups, that these kinds of interactions begin to take root, begin to happen in a very natural way. So as we go forward, we have to pay attention to increasing the sheer number of our graduate students and of our tenured and tenure-track faculty who come from various minority groups. I also think that activities such as our Committee on Campus Race Relations and other forums which bring people together to talk across whatever divides may exist, all these help. It helps just for people to know that they are wanted, that they have become part of the definition of the institution, and that they are part of the whole, part of the continuum that is MIT, that plays such a leadership and role in the world. Every member, student body, staff, faculty, administrator, understand that. I think we begin to bridge a lot of these issues right away. But at the end of the day, honesty, openness, candor, friendships are the things that really propel us forward.
Well, that's a point that sort of helps to bring up the second one, and that is, how would you summarize how you feel a non-minority faculty member can demonstrate leadership in bridging racial and cultural differences at our institution and in universities and colleges in general? But how would you summarize that?
Well, that's in some sense a difficult question. But I believe that one has to begin with personal beliefs, personal interactions. And just to be able to have the opportunity to have friendships across racial or other cultural boundaries, to me, is where it all starts. So I hate to use an overworked term like reaching out, but I think you just have to create opportunities where you're with people different than yourself, particularly in informal settings, as well as in direct professional settings. Learn from each other. Realize that you're going to gain as much by learning a different perspective as you're going to offer somebody else. And if you can kind of open those dialogues, then I think things begin to flow. Secondly, you have to learn not to be overly defensive. You have to learn that the world indeed looks a little bit different through someone else's eyes because their experience base is different. They may react to language a little bit differently. They may reflect unpleasant experiences into things that would never dawn on you. You have to be attuned to this, and both sides have to be attuned to that. And if you can get to that level of honesty and candor where people can tell you what they think, what's bothering them, what they enjoy, what goes well, what doesn't, then pretty soon you get beyond all this stuff and you get on with your lives together as colleagues and friends.
That's an excellent point, Chuck. I thought that one of the things that one of the bridge leaders I interviewed earlier pointed out was that they and their families spend a lot of time in India, and that this was sort of early in their faculty, experience here. And one of the things that they pointed out was that it helped them tremendously to be in a minority position.
Of course.
But on the other hand, they recognized that it was sort of a privileged minority position, but it gave them a sense about going into relationships with people whereby they really were always attuned to trying to see how they could actually understand the other person, as well as how that person would see them, as opposed to the other way around. And that's kind of the point I think I hear you making.
Well, I have not had as profound an experience as living for an extended period of time under such conditions, but I certainly have had lots of experiences of being in a room in which I was the only or one of a very small number of whites, or I was the only or one of a very small number of males. And I absolutely agree, even in that sort of microcosm or microscale, those experiences are important. You learn from them. They make you think a little bit.
When we look at, say, at MIT, and we say, well, what are some of the really best practices that are demonstrated in terms of bridging racial and cultural differences, specific programs and results that you have been involved with or have observed over the years? Could you name some of the things that you consider as really good practices that you've actually either seen as programs or you've seen people involved in or directing and so on? Some of the things you've been, not only here but elsewhere, that you would consider as good practices that help in that situation.
Well, I think that when we consider MIT, we have to begin with the one thing that we can be very proud of in this realm, and that's the composition of our undergraduate student body. And it shows what happens when an administration and the relevant faculty committee can kind of set a strategy, set a policy that says we're going to work extraordinarily hard to identify the very best and brightest minority youngsters in the country, and we're going to recruit hard to try to convince them to come to MIT. And we're not going to do it the easy way. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way of showing what the opportunities are here, of continuing to hold true to our need-blind admission and need-based financial aid policies, but over time it has worked. So that, to me, is in some sense a best practice. In a very different domain, I've been very pleased with having had a role in enabling and establishing the Committee on Campus Race Relations, which stands out to me because it is a group that originally came together on a purely volunteer basis that was composed of a wide range of cultural and racial backgrounds that involved students and faculty and staff. They just came together because they were concerned and they cared, and I was able to fund them a bit and enable them and give them an official sanction, so to speak, the institution. And that group, I think, has accomplished a lot by making even relatively modest resources available for groups, particularly student groups, from the grassroots up, coming up with ideas that they thought would improve race relations on the campus. Over time, that has helped. I also think that there are times when unfortunate situations occur that you have to stand up and be counted and say what you think. And I was reflecting not long ago on the unfortunate situation we had about a year ago where there was a very unseemly verbal exchange and then actually a little physical exchange between some of our students and members of an African American band that was appearing on campus. And I just decided that this can't stand, and while it wasn't so much a matter of discipline and force, I had to say what was important, and I said it, and I got it out on the email networks to the students. And for months after that, I would just be stopped at random by students as I crossed campus, thanking me and saying how important that was. I don't mean to point to myself as a best practice, but I do think any administrator has to recognize these critical moments at which something that has a racial or cultural content that is not right, you have to stand up and say it. Not too frequently, or you lose the edge and ability to influence things, but that, I think, is important. And finally, outside of MIT, I had the great opportunity to be involved for many years with GEM, a consortium of universities and industries that identify and foster and support talented young minority men and women to go to graduate school in engineering and now in science as well. And I was fortunate to serve as their national president for 3 years and had an opportunity to help identify within that organization what they really did well, what was their best practice, and be sure that we kept focused on doing those tasks. And I think GEM has a lot to show for that in terms of success, and as an organization we can all look to with a certain amount of pride. And finally, while we're just within the first couple of years of its existence, the new Council on Faculty Diversity, which was appointed by Bob Brown after he and I and some other faculty leaders began to wrestle with why we weren't getting farther in terms of building the numbers of minorities and women in our tenured and tenure-track faculty. I believe that this group is starting to take root, starting to get at the core of the interactions with the department heads and the committees within the individual departments. And I think over time we're going to see that group under the leadership of Bob and Wes Harris and Nancy Hopkins. I think that group, if we look back a few years from now, is going to stand as best practice. I'm very optimistic about that.
Well, that's excellent, I think, because that is certainly the area that not only MIT is struggling with, but a host of major universities are. And as we talked earlier, it's going to take a group kind of like that to really spend some time together and focus and get to know each other and really help, those in the various departments that will need their kind of support and ideas about how they can struggle with the area that they may not quite know how well to do.
Well, it's hard work, and it's a major and important challenge, and we can never let up.
Well, Chuck, is there any other comment you want to make on this whole issue as far as bridge leaders are concerned? I think you've covered nearly all the things that I think I wanted to talk about, but our campus is a very unique campus, and as you said earlier, the one area that we can take a tremendous amount of pride in is our student body and the diversity. And as you said, so many people you can't sometimes appreciate it until you go elsewhere. And then when you come back on our campus, you really see,
yes,
how positive our undergraduate, diversity is.
There really is a great energy and joy that comes from just walking down the hallways here and seeing this great diversity of students. And frequently when I visit other campuses, something doesn't seem quite right to me, and all of a sudden I realize that's it. They don't look like we do. So that's something that I think can energize us and enthuse us. But Clarence, if there's one thought I could leave with you about my perspective on bridges and bridge building and bridge leadership, to use this interesting term that you have given us, it's that my own experience is those bridges come inward to me more than they come outward from me. What I've been so pleased about throughout much of my life and certainly my professional career have actually been the bridges that minority colleagues and faculty and students and fellow administrators and staff members have built to me, that they've been open to me, that they've welcomed me into their world, not just waiting for me to welcome them into mine. And there's a great reward in this, because the richness of experience and perspective that you gain by really getting to know other people and being open and honest and candid with them is amazing. And to me, it's been more a matter that they've been willing to bridge from their life and their perspective into mine than it has been that in some sense I'm building it outward. I guess it has to come from both sides of the river. But I think that everybody has to recognize that if you participate in these things, you're going to benefit most likely more than what you're going to give.
That's an excellent point. Before we close, I wanted to point out one really excellent practice that I think is very much related to the whole concept that we've talked about. And as you recall, I asked you, to talk a little bit about some of the things that you would consider as best practices, and in terms of your administration. And you talked about a number of things, but there was one area that I want to make sure that is pointed out here, and that is, even though you probably will not take credit in a way, but it is a major point, and that is, for the first time in the history of MIT, you appointed a chancellor who happens to be a minority, and that has never existed at this institution, and there's never been anyone that high on that level at this institution. So I have to say that's